Malcolm Carter stretched his arms, feeling the early morning sun warm his skin. His private island was his sanctuary, a place he had worked his whole life to afford. The gentle waves of Sapphire Lake lapped against the shore and a light breeze carried the scent of pine and fresh earth. He took a deep breath, relishing the peace. Then the ground shook. A deep, guttural rumbling shattered the silence. Birds exploded from the trees, squawking in alarm. Malcolm's eyes snapped open just in time to see a line of massive yellow bulldozers rolling onto his land, crushing his carefully planted wildflowers and tearing through the soft earth like it was nothing. What the hell? He bolted upright from his chair, heart pounding. The deafening roar of heavy machinery filled the air as workers in bright vests leaped off trucks, barking orders. A massive steel claw dug into the earth near his dock, ripping out an old oak tree like it was a weed. Malcolm ran onto his porch, his bare feet slamming against the wooden planks. "Hey, stop! What the hell are you doing on my land?" The workers ignored him. Chainsaws roared to life. Another tree crashed to the ground, splintering on impact. His garden fence smashed, his gazebo crushed under metal treads. His fists clenched as he stormed down the steps, charging toward the nearest worker. "I said stop!" A stocky man in a hard hat barely looked up. "Orders from the HOA, sir. Step back." The HOA? Malcolm's blood turned to ice. He had heard of their ruthless control over the mainland community, but he had bought this island to escape their grasp. His deeds said, private property. No one was supposed to touch this land but him. He grabbed his phone, dialing 911. The call connected immediately. "There are bulldozers on my land. They're tearing everything up. My trees, my garden. I need police here now." The dispatcher's voice was flat. "Sir, we've already received a call from the Pinehurst Point HOA. They have proper permits for this work." Malcolm's breath caught. "No, they don't. This is my land. Sir, you'll have to take it up with the HOA directly. This is a civil matter." Click. The call ended. Malcolm stood there, stunned, the dial tone ringing in his ears. A sleek black SUV pulled up near the chaos. A woman in an expensive gray suit stepped out, clipboard in hand. Her platinum blonde hair was perfectly styled, and her cold blue eyes scanned the destruction with the indifference of someone inspecting a construction site. Margaret Sinclair, HOA president. She turned to face him with a tight plastic smile. "Mr. Carter, I presume?" Malcolm felt rage bubbling up in his chest. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" She sighed, pulling a stack of papers from her designer handbag. "We've approved the installation of 172 solar panels on this island. It's for the community's benefit." "Community? This is private property." Margaret's smile didn't falter. She held up a document. "Actually, we can. Section 8, paragraph 12 of the covenant you signed states that the association reserves access rights to waterfront properties for community improvements." Malcolm snatched the papers, scanning them. It was legal jargon, a wall of fine print. But one thing was clear. He had never signed off on this. His stomach twisted. Somehow the HOA had found a loophole, and they were going to steal his island right in front of his eyes. Malcolm gripped his phone, pacing across what was left of his ruined lawn. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the wreckage. The fallen trees, the torn-up flower beds, the shattered remains of his gazebo. His sanctuary was turning into a construction zone. The phone clicked. "Simon, tell me you found something." Simon Reynolds, his real estate lawyer, exhaled sharply. "It's bad, Malcolm. That clause Margaret pulled up? It wasn't in the original HOA covenant." Malcolm's stomach tightened. "Then how the hell did it get there? It looks like an amendment was added recently, but there's no record of a proper vote. If they didn't get 75% homeowner approval, it's invalid. So they're operating on fraud? Pretty much. But proving it won't be easy." Malcolm ran a hand down his face. He should have been relieved. If this was illegal, he could fight it. But if the HOA had faked legal documents once, what else could they manipulate? A rustling sound made him turn. An old woman wrapped in a faded green shawl stood at the edge of his dock, gripping a wooden cane. Miss Jenkins. She had lived across the lake for decades, a kind but quiet presence in the community. She rarely left her cottage, but now her dark eyes darted around nervously. "You need to be careful, Malcolm," she whispered, stepping closer. "Margaret Sinclair doesn't lose." Malcolm frowned. "What do you mean?" Miss Jenkins sighed. "You think you're the first black man she's tried to push out?" Malcolm stiffened. 2 years ago, the Wilsons lived in that house on the East Shore. Miss Jenkins pointed across the water. "A black couple. They fought Margaret over zoning violations, refused to let the HOA tear down their boat dock. One day, their house caught fire." Malcolm's blood ran cold. "You're saying no proof, no investigation?" She tapped her cane against the ground. "They left the next week. Margaret got the HOA to fine them into submission." "That's how she works." Malcolm's fists clenched. "And this solar project?" Miss Jenkins lowered her voice. "Margaret's husband owns Sinclair Energy." Malcolm's breath hitched. "The same company installing the solar panels?" Miss Jenkins nodded. "HOA paid 3 times the market price for those panels. Guess where the extra money went?" Malcolm exhaled sharply, straight into her husband's pockets. She placed a wrinkled hand on his arm. "This isn't about energy, Malcolm. It never was. They're taking your land for profit. And if you fight back," she hesitated, "be ready. She plays dirty." Malcolm wasn't backing down. The next morning, he stormed into the HOA office, documents in hand. He slammed them onto the front desk, making the receptionist jump. "I want a meeting, now." The receptionist, an older white woman with glasses perched on her nose, didn't even blink. "You'll have to file a formal request, Mr. Carter. HOA meetings are held bi-weekly." Malcolm scoffed. "Bi-weekly? By then my island will look like a damn power plant." "Not my problem," she replied, tapping away at her keyboard. "Take it up with President Sinclair." Malcolm clenched his jaw and stormed out. That's when the harassment started. At first, it was small. His trash wasn't collected. Everyone else's bins were emptied, but his sat untouched at the edge of his driveway, overflowing with garbage. Then came the fines. A bright yellow envelope appeared in his mailbox. "Violation notice. Unauthorized modifications to waterfront property. Fine, $200 per day." Malcolm frowned. Modifications? He hadn't done anything. The next day, another notice. "Boat dock exceeds HOA size restrictions." Bullshit. The dock had been there before he even bought the property. By the end of the week, there were 6 separate violations, each carrying hundreds of dollars in fines. Then it got personal. Malcolm pulled into his driveway one evening to find his mailbox ripped from the ground. The wooden post was snapped in half like someone had taken a bat to it. His stomach twisted. When he checked his security cameras, the footage was missing. Deleted. Someone had hacked into his system. That night, he barely slept. He sat on his porch, shotgun across his lap, waiting. Nothing happened. Until the next morning, a sleek black Mercedes pulled up in front of his house. Margaret Sinclair stepped out, dressed in her usual impeccable gray suit. This time, her fake smile was gone. "Morning, Mr. Carter," she said smoothly, walking toward his porch. Malcolm didn't move. "Get off my property." She stopped at the base of his steps, tilting her head. "Oh, Malcolm, you're making this so much harder than it has to be." "Harder for who? You? Your husband's dirty company?" Margaret sighed, inspecting her manicured nails. "You can't win this. The fines will keep coming. The legal battles will drain you. And the community?" She gave a cruel smile. "They don't care about you." Malcolm's fist clenched. Then she said it. "Your kind should know better than to fight the system." The words hit like a slap. Malcolm exhaled slowly, rage burning in his gut. He had been fighting systems like this his whole life, and he wasn't about to stop now. Malcolm sat in his living room, surrounded by old boxes from his attic. His hands trembled as he flipped through a worn, leather-bound diary, his grandfather's. Dr. Elijah Carter, a brilliant botanist, had filled these pages with notes about tree species, growth rates, and natural defenses against environmental destruction. Malcolm's eyes caught a passage, underlined in bold ink. Hybrid poplars, Empress, trees grow 10, 12 feet per year. A natural privacy wall, tall, dense, and impossible to remove without legal battles. A slow smile spread across his face. That was it. If he couldn't fight them in court, he'd fight them with nature. He was going to build an army of trees. The next night, Malcolm worked in silence. With a shovel in one hand and a flashlight in the other, he carefully planted the first row of saplings along the shoreline, right where the solar panels would soon stand. The soil was still loose from the bulldozer damage, making it easier to dig. One sapling, 2, 10, 20. He barely noticed the time passing until a sudden beam of light flashed across his hands. Malcolm froze. A voice cut through the darkness. "What are you doing out here?" He turned slowly, heart pounding. It was Daniel Reed, the HOA security guard, a young black man in his late 20s, dressed in a crisp uniform. Malcolm tightened his grip on the shovel, preparing for another fight. But Daniel just stood there, looking at the tiny trees Malcolm had already planted. Then his expression softened. "My dad used to own a home on this lake," Daniel muttered. "Margaret ran him out too. HOA fines buried him in debt until he had no choice but to sell." Malcolm studied him, unsure where this was going. Then Daniel exhaled, shaking his head. "I don't come to this side of the island until 2 a.m. That gives you 3 more hours." Malcolm blinked. "You're serious?" Daniel nodded. "If you need a hand, I know how to dig." For the first time in days, Malcolm let out a real laugh. "Then grab a shovel." Together under the cover of night, they worked in silence, planting over 200 saplings in perfectly spaced rows. By sunrise, his army of trees was in place. The first step toward taking his land back had begun. The smell of smoke ripped Malcolm out of his sleep. At first, he thought it was just a bad dream, until he saw the orange glow flickering through his bedroom window. His stomach dropped. He threw open the door and sprinted outside, heart hammering against his ribs. Flames. A wall of fire raged along the shoreline, devouring his newly planted saplings. The young trees cracked and collapsed, their bright green leaves curling into black ash. "No!" Malcolm roared, grabbing a bucket and rushing to the lake. He filled it and sprinted back, throwing water onto the blaze, but it was useless. The fire was too strong, too deliberate. Then through the thick smoke he saw her, Karen Matthews. The HOA vice president stood at a distance, near her parked white SUV, watching the flames with a twisted little smirk on her face. The moment she saw Malcolm looking, she slowly pulled out her phone, took a picture, then drove away. Like she wanted him to know, like she wanted him to suffer. Malcolm's hands trembled with rage. His trees, his protection, his plan, gone. But if they thought he'd roll over and give up, they were wrong. He grabbed his phone and started recording. The fire, the damage, the tire tracks leading straight from Karen's SUV. Then he turned his camera to the workers standing nearby, HOA maintenance crew. They had shovels, hoses, and fire extinguishers, but they weren't using them. They just stood there watching. Malcolm stepped closer, still recording. "Why aren't you putting it out?" One of the men, a tall, lanky guy with a guilty expression, glanced away. "Just following orders." "Whose orders?" Malcolm demanded. The man didn't answer. But Malcolm already knew. The next morning, Malcolm marched straight into the local sheriff's office. He slammed his phone onto the counter. "I want to report arson. HOA burned down my trees." The deputy sighed, barely looking up. "Do you have solid proof?" Malcolm pulled up the footage. "Right here." The deputy glanced at the video, then shrugged. "Hard to say who actually set the fire. Could have been an accident." "An accident?" Malcolm repeated, his voice sharp. "Workers were there. They did nothing to stop it." The deputy clicked his pen lazily. "Look, HOA says it was a controlled burn for fire safety reasons." No laws broken. Malcolm clenched his fists. "That's bullshit, and you know it." The deputy sighed again. "Take it up with the county board. Malcolm stared at him, realizing exactly what this was. The system was rigged. But he wasn't done fighting. Not yet. Malcolm sat at his kitchen table staring at his laptop screen. A new email. No subject, no sender name. Just two words, check attachment. He hesitated for a moment, then clicked. A PDF file popped open, dozens of old HOA financial records, board meeting minutes, and legal documents. One line was highlighted in bright yellow. HOA project funds allocated to Sinclair Energy, approved without community vote. Malcolm's pulse quickened. Sinclair Energy, Margaret's husband's company. Another document showed a wire transfer of $200,000 to a private account linked to Karen Matthews. And then, a scanned signature page. His breath caught. The homeowners' approvals for the solar project were forged. Margaret had faked the vote. This wasn't just HOA corruption. This was fraud. And now he had the proof. The HOA's monthly meeting was packed. More residents than usual had shown up, curious about the solar project controversy. Margaret sat at the head table, calm and poised in her tailored suit. Karen Matthews smirked beside her, sunglasses perched on her head. Malcolm stood at the back, watching, waiting. Margaret tapped the mic. Let's begin. First order of business. Actually, Malcolm interrupted, stepping forward. I have something to present. Margaret's eyes narrowed. Mr. Carter, this is not the time. Malcolm pulled out his phone. It's the perfect time. He tapped the screen, and the projector behind her lit up. First, he showed the burned trees video. Gasps echoed through the room. People turned to look at Margaret and Karen. Then, he swiped to the forged signatures. A murmur spread through the crowd. Finally, he pulled up the Sinclair Energy wire transfer records. Margaret's expression didn't crack, but Karen shifted uncomfortably in her seat. A man in the front row, Thomas Harrison, a longtime HOA member, stood up. Are you telling me our HOA fees were funneled into Sinclair Energy? Malcolm nodded. You didn't just pay for solar panels. You paid for Margaret's husband's offshore bank account. More gasps. A few voices rose in outrage. Margaret leaned forward, gripping the mic. This is all circumstantial. Mr. Carter has no real proof that... A new voice cut her off. Actually, we do. The back doors swung open. Miss Jenkins walked in, with two county auditors. Margaret went pale. One of the auditors held up a folder. We've reviewed the HOA's financial records. There are serious discrepancies that warrant further investigation. Karen jumped up from her seat. This is ridiculous. But the community had already turned on them. A woman in the second row yelled, I never approved those solar panels? Another man added, where did all our extra fees go? Margaret stood abruptly. This meeting is adjourned. But no one was listening anymore. Because finally, the community saw the truth. This is ridiculous. But the community had already turned on them. A woman in the second row yelled, I never approved those solar panels? Another man added, where did all our extra fees go? Margaret stood abruptly. This meeting is adjourned. But no one was listening anymore. Because finally, the community saw the truth. Margaret Sinclair stormed toward the exit, her heels clicking sharply against the wooden floor. Karen Matthews was right behind her, clutching her designer purse like it was a lifeline. But they never made it to the door. Two uniformed police officers stepped in, blocking their path. Margaret Sinclair, Karen Matthews, you're under arrest for financial fraud, forgery, and misappropriation of community funds. The room fell into stunned silence. Margaret whirled around, her face livid. You can't do this! I built this HOA! Click. The cold sound of handcuffs snapping shut cut her off. Karen, wide-eyed and panicked, turned to the crowd. You can't let them take us! We were doing what was best for the community. By stealing from us? Miss Jenkins shot back. Margaret's carefully curated facade cracked. You people don't understand how power works. You think this ends here? Malcolm folded his arms. No, but your career does. The officers led them out as the community watched in silence. Then someone started clapping. A moment later, the entire room erupted in cheers. 1 month later, the sun was warm on Malcolm's skin as he stood at the edge of his dock, looking at the lake. His trees were alive again. The few that had survived the fire stood tall and strong, while new saplings stretched toward the sky. Malcolm knelt down, brushing dirt from his hands. He had spent weeks replanting, working alongside neighbors who had once ignored his fight, but now stood by his side. A voice called from behind him, "They're looking good." He turned to see Daniel Reed, the ex-HOA security guard, now wearing a crisp new suit. Malcolm grinned. "Yeah, you ever seen trees grow out of pure revenge?" Daniel chuckled. "We've seen crazier things in this neighborhood." They both turned toward the community center, where workers were installing the last of the relocated solar panels. This time, they were placed where they should have been all along. The HOA had been restructured from the ground up. The community had voted out every corrupt board member, and now there was a new president. Daniel straightened his tie. "They're waiting for you inside." Malcolm followed him into the building, where residents filled the seats. At the front, Miss Jenkins stood behind the podium, a gavel in hand. She cleared her throat. "As the newly appointed president of the Pinehurst Point HOA, I'd like to make something very clear." She looked around the room, meeting every eye. "We're making sure this never happens again." A wave of applause filled the room. Malcolm exhaled, feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. His home, his island, was finally his again. And no one was ever going to take it from him.